Marcus Kane was once a name that echoed in boxing circles, a man whose fists carried the promise of greatness. Born into a modest family, Marcus had grown up idolizing legendary fighters, dreaming of the day he'd step into the ring and make his mark. By his early 20s, he was already making waves. His powerful punches and relentless determination earned him a loyal fan base and lucrative contracts. But beneath the glitz and glamour of his rising career lay cracks that would eventually shatter everything. It started small: missed training sessions, late-night parties, and an ego that swelled with every victory. Marcus began to believe he was invincible, untouchable. That arrogance led to his downfall. Losses piled up faster than he could recover, and soon promoters stopped calling. The same fans who once cheered for him turned their backs, leaving Marcus feeling abandoned and bitter. To make matters worse, financial troubles crept in. Loans he couldn't repay and mounting bills pushed him deeper into despair. But it wasn't just money that broke Marcus. It was his inability to control his temper. What began as harmless grumbles during losses escalated into explosive outbursts. He got into heated arguments with trainers, referees, and even fellow boxers. One infamous incident saw him storming out of a match midway, slamming doors and shouting profanities. It didn't take long for people to label him unstable. Promoters refused to work with him, fearing another scandal. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to deal with his unpredictable behavior. The final straw came one rainy night outside a dimly lit bar. After overhearing two men mocking his failed career, Marcus snapped. Words turned into shoves, and shoves turned into punches. When the police arrived, Marcus was sitting on the curb, drenched and trembling, while the two men were rushed to the hospital with minor injuries. The media had a field day, painting Marcus as a loose cannon, a man too dangerous to be around others. Amidst all this chaos, Captain Eleanor Hart lived a life worlds apart from Marcus's turmoil. As a decorated member of the Royal Guard, she embodied discipline and grace. Her journey to becoming a protector of the crown was no easy feat. Years of rigorous training and unwavering dedication shaped her into the woman she was today, a symbol of strength and loyalty. Yet despite her stern exterior, Eleanor possessed a compassionate heart. She believed in second chances and understood the weight of carrying burdens alone. Eleanor's duties often brought her face to face with challenging situations, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Unbeknownst to both of them, fate was weaving a story that would intertwine their lives in ways neither could imagine. While Marcus spiraled further into darkness, Eleanor remained steadfast in her commitment to duty. Little did she know that an ordinary assignment protecting the royal family during a public appearance would lead to an encounter that would test not only her skills, but also her humanity. As days passed, Marcus found himself consumed by anger, not just at the world, but at himself. He hated how far he'd fallen, yet he couldn't find a way to rise again. Then news of a royal visit to his hometown reached him. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another headline scrolling across the TV screen. But something inside Marcus stirred. Maybe it was desperation or perhaps sheer recklessness, but he decided that this event would be his stage, his chance to prove he still mattered, even if it meant going against the very people society admired. What Marcus didn't realize was that standing between him and his misguided quest for relevance was someone who wouldn't back down without a fight. Someone like Captain Eleanor Hart. The morning of the royal visit dawned bright and clear, with the town buzzing in anticipation. Streets were lined with banners bearing the crest of the monarchy, and citizens gathered early to catch a glimpse of their beloved king. For most people, it was a day of celebration, a chance to feel connected to something greater than themselves. But for Marcus Kane, it was different. To him, this wasn't just another public appearance. It was an opportunity, albeit a reckless one. Marcus spent hours preparing, though not in the way others might expect. Instead of dressing neatly or planning how he'd behave respectfully, he focused on fueling his anger. He replayed old news clips of himself being ridiculed after his boxing career crumbled. He read cruel comments left by strangers online, each word stoking the fire inside him. By the time he stepped out of his small apartment, Marcus had convinced himself that attacking authority figures, starting with the royal guard, would somehow restore his lost pride. As he approached the crowded streets where the procession was scheduled to pass, Marcus felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers laid along the route, and children waved miniature flags enthusiastically. Despite the festive atmosphere, Marcus saw none of it. His eyes were locked on the barriers separating the crowd from the VIP area, his mind racing with thoughts of breaking through them. Nearby, Captain Eleanor Hart stood vigilant, scanning the sea of faces for any sign of trouble. Dressed in her immaculate uniform, she exuded calm confidence. Years of experience taught her to trust her instincts, and today they whispered warnings. Something about the energy in the crowd felt off, not overtly hostile, but simmering with tension. As she moved along the perimeter, her gaze landed briefly on Marcus, who lingered awkwardly near the barricades. At first glance, he didn't seem particularly threatening, just another man trying to get a better view. But there was something in his posture, the way he shifted uneasily, that caught her attention. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him, though she couldn't have predicted what was coming next. When the royal entourage finally arrived, cheers erupted from the crowd. The king waved graciously, smiling at the adoring masses. It was then that Marcus made his move. With surprising speed, he vaulted over the barrier, landing heavily on the other side. Gasps rippled through the spectators as they realized what was happening. Security teams sprang into action, but Marcus had already locked onto his target, Captain Hart. His approach was chaotic, fueled more by rage than strategy. Shouting incoherently, he charged straight at her, fists clenched. People screamed, scattering as panic spread like wildfire. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. For a brief second, Marcus allowed himself to imagine the shock and fear he'd instill in those around him. He was sure his boldness would leave everyone speechless. But what happened next shattered his illusion completely. Just as Marcus swung his fist toward Captain Hart's face, she moved with precision that defied his expectations. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped his attack, grabbing his wrist mid-swing. Before Marcus could react, she twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. Pain shot through his shoulder, but it barely registered compared to the shock coursing through him. How could someone so composed overpower him so easily? For a split second, Marcus froze, stunned by the realization that he'd underestimated his opponent. But his stubbornness refused to let him give up. Summoning whatever strength he had left, he wrenched free from her grip and lunged again, determined to prove he wasn't done yet. This time, however, Captain Hart didn't hesitate. She countered his attack with calculated efficiency, using his own momentum against him. Within moments, Marcus found himself stumbling backward, disoriented and struggling to regain balance. The crowd watched in awe as the scene unfolded before them. Some clapped instinctively, impressed by Captain Hart's skill, while others whispered nervously, unsure whether Marcus posed a real threat. Amidst the chaos, Captain Hart remained unfazed, her focus unwavering. She knew better than to underestimate anyone, no matter how irrational their actions seemed. What she didn't know was that this confrontation would reveal far more than just Marcus's desperation. It would expose vulnerabilities in both of them, setting the stage for a story neither could have anticipated. The clash between Marcus Kane and Captain Eleanor Hart escalated into a spectacle that no one in the crowd could look away from. What started as a reckless outburst had now turned into a raw physical battle, one that showcased not just brute strength, but also skill, strategy, and sheer willpower. Marcus, fueled by his chaotic emotions, threw punch after punch, each swing aimed with desperation rather than precision. His face was contorted with anger, sweat pouring down his temples as he tried to overpower the calm and composed figure standing before him. Captain Hart, on the other hand, moved like water, fluid, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. Every time Marcus lunged at her, she sidestepped or blocked his attacks with ease, her movements calculated and deliberate. To the onlookers, it seemed almost surreal. Here was a man who had spent years honing his body for combat, yet he couldn't land a single blow against this woman dressed in formal attire. It wasn't just her training that set her apart. It was her composure under pressure, her ability to stay focused even when chaos erupted around her. Despite his efforts, Marcus quickly realized that he was outmatched. Each failed attempt left him more frustrated, his swings growing wilder and less controlled. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his energy draining faster than he'd anticipated. Still, pride refused to let him back down. He told himself over and over again that he couldn't lose. Not here, not now. So, with one last burst of adrenaline, he charged forward, aiming a powerful hook at Captain Hart's head. But instead of meeting resistance, Marcus found only empty air. Captain Hart ducked beneath his arm, spinning gracefully to avoid the impact. Before he could recover, she grabbed his wrist and used his momentum to yank him off balance. With practiced efficiency, she swept her leg behind his, sending him crashing to the ground. The thud echoed through the tense silence that had fallen over the crowd. For a moment, Marcus lay there, stunned. Pain radiated through his side where he'd landed awkwardly, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation washing over him. People were staring, whispering, pointing. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every second of his downfall. He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth as shame burned hotter than any physical pain ever could. Captain Hart didn't give him time to dwell on it. She knelt beside him, her voice firm but devoid of malice. "Stay down," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes locked onto his, piercing through the haze of rage and embarrassment clouding his mind. For the first time since the fight began, Marcus hesitated. There was something about the way she looked at him, not with contempt or pity, but with an unshakable authority that demanded respect. Yet, stubbornness still held sway over him. Ignoring her warning, Marcus pushed himself up, wobbling slightly as he regained his footing. His chest heaved with exertion, his legs trembling beneath him, but he forced himself to stand tall. He couldn't afford to appear weak, not in front of everyone watching. Summoning the last remnants of his strength, he swung again, this time aiming low in hopes of catching her off guard. It was a mistake. Captain Hart saw it coming long before his fist reached her. With a swift movement, she stepped aside, delivering a sharp kick to the back of his knee. The unexpected blow buckled his leg, sending him tumbling forward once more. This time, she didn't wait for him to rise. In an instant, she was on him, pinning him to the ground with her knee pressed firmly against his chest. Marcus struggled briefly, thrashing and twisting in a futile attempt to break free. But Captain Hart's hold was unyielding, her position perfectly balanced. As the reality of his situation sank in, his struggles grew weaker until finally they stopped altogether. Lying there, defeated and exhausted, Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. They weren't tears of pain, though there was plenty of that. They were tears of frustration, of regret, of realizing how far he'd fallen. Above him, Captain Hart's expression softened slightly. She leaned closer, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You've lost," she said quietly but firmly. "Stop fighting before you hurt yourself further." Her words struck a chord deep within Marcus, hitting harder than any punch ever could. For the first time in years, he listened, not because he wanted to, but because he knew she was right. As the tension drained from his body, Marcus muttered a barely audible apology, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Around them, the crowd remained silent, unsure whether to cheer, gasp, or simply watch in stunned disbelief. One thing was certain: this encounter would leave its mark, not just on Marcus, but on everyone who witnessed it. The fight between Marcus Kane and Captain Eleanor Hart had reached its breaking point, but the aftermath of their clash carried a weight that neither of them could have anticipated. As Marcus lay pinned to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and shame, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The crowd, once buzzing with excitement and fear, now stood in stunned silence, watching as the man who had charged at the royal guard with such reckless bravado was reduced to a broken figure begging for mercy. Captain Hart remained calm, her knees still pressed firmly against Marcus's chest to ensure he wouldn't attempt another futile struggle. She studied him carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail: his sweat-soaked face, his clenched jaw, the tears streaming down his cheeks. It wasn't just physical defeat etched into his features. It was something deeper, a profound sense of despair that went beyond this moment. Despite his earlier aggression, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice steady, but tinged with curiosity. Her question hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His breathing was labored, each inhale and exhale sounding ragged and uneven. For a moment, he avoided her gaze, staring instead at the ground beneath him. But when he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, raw and unfiltered. I wanted to matter," he admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I thought if I did something big, something people would notice. Maybe they'd stop looking at me like I'm nothing." His confession was met with silence, not just from Captain Hart, but from the crowd as well. The anger and arrogance that had driven him moments ago seemed to evaporate, leaving behind only vulnerability. Captain Hart loosened her grip slightly, though she remained cautious. "You don't have to prove your worth by hurting others," she said gently, her tone shifting from firm authority to quiet understanding. "There are better ways to be seen, better ways to rebuild what you've lost." Marcus shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface again. "You don't understand," he muttered bitterly. "No one understands. My life is ruined. Everyone thinks I'm a joke, a failure. I can't even pay my bills. What am I supposed to do?" Her expression softened further, though her posture remained alert. Leaning closer, she lowered her voice so only he could hear. "I know what it's like to carry burdens," she said, "to feel like the world is against you. But lashing out won't fix anything. It'll only make things worse, for you and for everyone around you." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus truly looked at her, not as an opponent or an obstacle, but as a person. There was sincerity in her words, a depth that suggested she wasn't just reciting empty advice. He wondered briefly about her own struggles, the battles she must have fought to become the disciplined, respected figure standing before him now. As security personnel moved in to take over, Captain Hart stood up, releasing Marcus from her hold. She signaled for them to wait a moment, giving him a chance to compose himself. Kneeling beside him, she extended a hand, offering him a gesture of unexpected kindness. "Get up," she said firmly but not uncannily. "This doesn't have to define you. You're stronger than this." Marcus hesitated, staring at her outstretched hand. Pride warred with desperation inside him. But eventually he reached out, allowing her to help him to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he managed to stand, albeit unsteadily. As he brushed dirt off his clothes, he glanced at her, searching for judgment in her eyes. Instead, he found something else: compassion. The crowd, which had been eerily silent throughout the exchange, began to murmur again. Some whispered criticisms of Marcus's actions, while others expressed admiration for Captain Hart's restraint and empathy. News cameras continued to roll, capturing every detail of the scene. But none of that mattered to Marcus anymore. In that moment, all he could focus on was the woman in front of him, the one who had defeated him physically, but was now offering him a lifeline emotionally. As security officers led Marcus away, Captain Hart watched him go, her thoughts swirling with questions about what might come next. She knew his journey was far from over, that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But deep down, she believed in the possibility of redemption. for everyone, no matter how far they'd fallen. And perhaps in some small way, today's encounter had planted a seed of hope in Marcus Kane's heart, one that might someday grow into something meaningful. The aftermath of Marcus Kane's reckless attack on Captain Eleanor Hart left a lasting impression not just on him, but also on those who witnessed the dramatic scene unfold. As security officers escorted Marcus away, he walked with his head down, avoiding eye contact with the crowd that had gathered to watch the royal procession. The cheers and excitement from earlier in the day were replaced by murmurs of disbelief and judgment. Some whispered about how foolish Marcus had been to challenge someone like Captain Hart, while others quietly wondered what could have driven him to such an extreme act. Inside the makeshift holding area set up nearby, Marcus sat alone on a cold metal bench, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the past hour. He saw himself vaulting over the barrier, charging at Captain Hart with blind rage, and then falling to the ground, defeated, not just physically, but emotionally. The memory of her calm demeanor and unwavering control haunted him. She hadn't just beaten him. She'd exposed the cracks in his armor, forcing him to confront the pain and desperation he'd tried so hard to bury. But it wasn't just shame gnawing at him. It was something deeper. For the first time in years, Marcus felt seen. Not as a failed boxer or a reckless troublemaker, but as a person carrying wounds too heavy to bear alone. Captain Hart's words echoed in his mind. "This doesn't have to define you. You're stronger than this." At first he dismissed them as meaningless platitudes, but the more he thought about them, the more they resonated. Could she be right? Was there still hope for someone like him? Meanwhile, outside the holding area, Captain Hart stood deep in thought, reflecting on the encounter. To the spectators, she had appeared composed and unshaken, but inside, she wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt relief that the situation had ended without serious harm to anyone. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus breaking down on the ground, tears streaming down his face as he muttered apologies. There was something achingly human about his vulnerability, something that reminded her of her own struggles when she first joined the Royal Guard. Years ago, Eleanor had faced her own share of doubts and failures. She remembered the grueling training sessions where she pushed herself to the brink of exhaustion, determined to prove she belonged among the elite ranks of the Guard. She recalled moments of self-doubt, when voices, both external and internal, questioned whether she was strong enough, disciplined enough, worthy enough. It was only through perseverance and support from mentors that she found her footing. Now, looking back, she realized how close she had come to giving up, and how much she owed to those who extended kindness during her darkest hours. Determined to offer Marcus the same lifeline, Eleanor made a decision. After ensuring that proper protocols were followed regarding his arrest, she requested permission to speak with him privately before he was handed over to local authorities. Her superiors hesitated initially, citing protocol and safety concerns, but Eleanor's reputation spoke for itself. Reluctantly, they agreed, trusting her judgment. When Marcus was brought into the small room where Eleanor waited, he looked surprised to see her. His shoulders tensed, expecting another lecture or reprimand. Instead, she gestured for him to sit across from her, her expression softer than before. "I wanted to talk to you," she began, her voice calm but sincere. "Not as a member of the Royal Guard, but as someone who's been where you are." Marcus frowned, unsure of what to say. "Where I am," he repeated, his tone laced with bitterness. "You don't know anything about me." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Maybe not everything," she admitted, "but I know what it's like to feel invisible, to think the world has written you off. And I know what it feels like to lash out because you're hurting inside." Her words caught Marcus off guard. He stared at her, searching for any hint of mockery or condescension, but found none. Instead, he saw genuine empathy, a reflection of the compassion he glimpsed earlier when she offered him her hand. Against his will, his defenses began to crumble. The aftermath of Marcus Kane's reckless attack on Captain Eleanor Hart left a lasting impression not just on him, but also on those who witnessed the dramatic scene unfold. As security officers escorted Marcus away, he walked with his head down, avoiding eye contact with the crowd that had gathered to watch the royal procession. The cheers and excitement from earlier in the day were replaced by murmurs of disbelief and judgment. Some whispered about how foolish Marcus had been to challenge someone like Captain Hart, while others quietly wondered what could have driven him to such an extreme act. Inside the makeshift holding area set up nearby, Marcus sat alone on a cold metal bench, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the past hour. He saw himself vaulting over the barrier, charging at Captain Hart with blind rage, and then falling to the ground, defeated, not just physically, but emotionally. The memory of her calm demeanor and unwavering control haunted him. She hadn't just beaten him. She'd exposed the cracks in his armor, forcing him to confront the pain and desperation he'd tried so hard to bury. But it wasn't just shame gnawing at him. It was something deeper. For the first time in years, Marcus felt seen. Not as a failed boxer or a reckless troublemaker, but as a person carrying wounds too heavy to bear alone. Captain Hart's words echoed in his mind. "This doesn't have to define you. You're stronger than this." At first, he dismissed them as meaningless platitudes, but the more he thought about them, the more they resonated. Could she be right? Was there still hope for someone like him? Meanwhile, outside the holding area, Captain Hart stood deep in thought, reflecting on the encounter. To the spectators, she had appeared composed and unshaken, but inside, she wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt relief that the situation had ended without serious harm to anyone. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus breaking down on the ground, tears streaming down his face as he muttered apologies. There was something itchingly human about his vulnerability, something that reminded her of her own struggles when she first joined the Royal Guard. Years ago, Eleanor had faced her own share of doubts and failures. She remembered the grueling training sessions where she pushed herself to the brink of exhaustion, determined to prove she belonged among the elite ranks of the Guard. She recalled moments of self-doubt, when voices, both external and internal, questioned whether she was strong enough, disciplined enough, worthy enough. It was only through perseverance and support from mentors that she found her footing. Now, looking back, she realized how close she had come to giving up, and how much she owed to those who extended kindness during her darkest hours. Determined to offer Marcus the same lifeline, Eleanor made a decision. After ensuring that proper protocols were followed regarding his arrest, she requested permission to speak with him privately before he was handed over to local authorities. Her superiors hesitated initially, citing protocol and safety concerns, but Eleanor's reputation spoke for itself. Reluctantly, they agreed, trusting her judgment. When Marcus was brought into the small room where Eleanor waited, he looked surprised to see her. His shoulders tensed, expecting another lecture or reprimand. Instead, she gestured for him to sit across from her, her expression softer than before. "I wanted to talk to you," she began, her voice calm but sincere. "Not as a member of the Royal Guard, but as someone who's been where you are." Marcus frowned, unsure of what to say. "Where I am," he repeated, his tone laced with bitterness. "You don't know anything about me." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Maybe not everything," she admitted, "but I know what it's like to feel invisible, to think the world has written you off. And I know what it feels like to lash out because you're hurting inside." Her words caught Marcus off guard. He stared at her, searching for any hint of mockery or condescension, but found none. Instead, he saw genuine empathy, a reflection of the compassion he'd glimpsed earlier when she offered him her hand. Against his will, his defenses began to crumble. In the weeks following the royal visit, Marcus Kane's life took a turn he never expected. The incident had made headlines across the nation, with news outlets dissecting every detail of his failed attack on Captain Eleanor Hart. While some labeled him as nothing more than a reckless troublemaker, others began to dig deeper into his story. Journalists uncovered interviews with former coaches, friends, and even family members who painted a picture of a man struggling, not just with failure, but with inner demons that had consumed him. The public reaction was mixed. Some condemned Marcus outright, calling for harsh penalties to ensure he wouldn't act out again. Others, however, sympathized with his plight, pointing out how easily society discards people when they fall from grace. Social media lit up with debates about mental health, second chances, and the pressures faced by athletes whose careers are short-lived. Amidst all the noise, one voice stood out: Captain Hart herself. During a press conference held shortly after the event, Eleanor addressed the media with characteristic poise. When asked about Marcus, she didn't shy away from acknowledging his mistakes, but emphasized the importance of compassion and rehabilitation over punishment alone. "We all make poor choices at some point in our lives," she said, her tone measured yet heartfelt. "What matters is whether we choose to learn from them and grow. I believe Marcus Kane deserves an opportunity to do just that." Her words resonated deeply, not only with the general public, but also with those closest to Marcus. Inspired by her advocacy, local authorities decided against pursuing maximum charges against him. Instead, they offered him a chance to enter a court-mandated rehabilitation program designed for individuals struggling with anger management and emotional instability. It wasn't an easy path, far from it, but it was a lifeline Marcus desperately needed. The program proved challenging in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Days were filled with group therapy sessions, counseling appointments, and rigorous physical activities aimed at channeling his energy constructively. At first, Marcus resisted, feeling exposed and vulnerable as he shared parts of himself he'd long kept hidden. But slowly, through conversations with therapists and interactions with fellow participants, he began to understand the root causes of his behavior. He realized how much of his aggression stemmed from unresolved pain caused by years of self-doubt, financial strain, and societal neglect. One day during a particularly intense session, Marcus opened up about his boxing career. He spoke candidly about the pressure to succeed, the loneliness of being in the spotlight, and the crushing weight of failure. For the first time, he allowed himself to grieve the loss of something he'd loved so dearly. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted, "I didn't know who I was without boxing, so I became angry. At everyone, at everything, at myself." His honesty earned respect from both peers and counselors. They encouraged him to rebuild his identity, not around past achievements or failures, but around values like perseverance, humility, and service. To help him stay grounded, they suggested volunteering at community centers, where he could mentor young athletes and share lessons he'd learned the hard way. At first hesitant, Marcus eventually embraced the idea, finding solace in helping others navigate challenges similar to his own. News of Marcus's progress reached Captain Hart, who kept tabs on him discreetly. Though their encounter had been brief, it left a lasting impression on her. Determined to see him succeed, she arranged a private meeting several months later. Their reunion was emotional. Marcus thanked her profusely for showing him kindness when he least deserved it, while Eleanor acknowledged his determination to change. She even extended an invitation that caught him completely off guard, to participate in a charity boxing match organized by the Royal Guard to raise awareness about mental health. Marcus accepted without hesitation. The event would be symbolic, a chance to step back into the ring not as a fighter fueled by rage, but as someone seeking redemption. As he trained rigorously for the match, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each punch thrown in practice carried less anger and more focus, each drop of sweat a testament to his commitment to transformation. When the night of the charity match finally arrived, Marcus stepped onto the stage greeted by thunderous applause. Standing alongside Captain Hart, who cheered him on from the sidelines, he realized how far he'd come. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, Marcus knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the same man who had attacked her months ago. He was stronger, not because he'd won every battle, but because he'd chosen to fight for something greater than himself. The night of the charity boxing match arrived, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The event was held in a modest sports arena, its seats filled with spectators from all walks of life, some eager to see Marcus Kane step back into the ring, others curious about how far he'd come since his infamous attack on Captain Eleanor Hart. Posters promoting mental health awareness lined the walls, and volunteers handed out pamphlets encouraging open conversations about emotional struggles. It wasn't just a fight. It was a celebration of resilience, redemption, and second chances. Marcus stood backstage, pacing nervously as he adjusted the tape around his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear of losing, but from the weight of what this moment represented. For months, he had worked tirelessly to rebuild himself physically, mentally, and emotionally. Every early morning run, every counseling session, every late-night reflection had led him here. This wasn't just another match. It was his chance to prove that people can change, that even those who stumble can rise again. Captain Hart joined him moments before he was set to enter the ring. Dressed casually for the occasion, she carried an air of quiet confidence as always. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. Marcus nodded, though his expression betrayed his nerves. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I mess up? What if everyone's watching me fail again?" Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've already won," she said firmly. "Just stepping into this ring tonight shows more courage than most people will ever show in their lifetime. Don't focus on winning or losing. Focus on why you're here. That's what matters." Her words steadied him, grounding him in the purpose behind the event. Taking a deep breath, Marcus nodded once more, determination replacing doubt in his eyes. As his name was announced over the loudspeaker, the crowd erupted into cheers. He walked out under the bright lights, squinting against the glare as he stepped into the ring. The noise was deafening, a mix of applause, whistles, and chants. For once, Marcus didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt connected, part of something bigger than himself. His opponent was a seasoned amateur boxer known for his speed and agility. The match began cautiously, with both fighters testing each other's defenses. Marcus moved deliberately, conserving his energy while staying alert. Unlike his earlier days in the ring, when anger drove every punch, he fought with intention now, focusing on technique and strategy. Each blow landed cleanly, each block executed with precision. The crowd watched intently, their cheers growing louder with every exchange. By the third round, fatigue began to set in. Sweat dripped down Marcus's face, and his muscles burned with exertion. But instead of letting frustration take over, he drew strength from the support surrounding him. Every time he glanced at the sidelines, he saw Captain Hart standing tall, her presence a reminder of how far he'd come. Even when his opponent landed a solid hit, sending a jolt of pain through his ribs, Marcus gritted his teeth and pushed forward, refusing to give in. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the match, Marcus stood exhausted but proud. Though he hadn't won the fight, the judge's decision mattered little to him. What truly mattered was the journey that brought him here, the countless hours spent rebuilding not just his body, but his spirit. As he raised his gloved hand in gratitude toward the cheering crowd, tears welled up in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had charged recklessly at Captain Hart months ago. He was someone new, someone stronger, wiser, and determined to keep moving forward. After the match, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers, fans, friends, and strangers alike congratulating him on his performance. Among them was Captain Hart, who approached with a proud smile. "You did great," she said simply, her approval meaning more to Marcus than any trophy ever could. "Thank you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Eleanor shook her head gently. "You did this yourself, Marcus. All I did was remind you of what you were capable of. The rest was all you." As they shared a brief hug, Marcus realized that this moment wasn't just about closure, it was about beginnings. He still had work to do, challenges to face, and lessons to learn. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. Standing there, surrounded by people who believed in him, Marcus knew he wasn't alone. And sometimes, that made all the difference. The charity boxing match marked a turning point in Marcus Kane's life, but it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting deeply on the path he had taken and the road ahead. The applause from the crowd still echoed in his mind, not because it was loud or overwhelming, but because it carried something he hadn't felt in years. Acceptance. For so long, Marcus had defined himself by his failures, letting them overshadow everything else. But now, standing on the other side of one of the hardest battles he'd ever fought, he realized that failure didn't have to be the end. It could be a starting point. Word of Marcus's transformation spread quickly, thanks in part to media coverage of the event. Journalists who once painted him as a reckless troublemaker now wrote stories about his resilience and determination to change. His participation in the charity match became a symbol of hope for others struggling with their own demons. Letters and messages poured in from people across the country, many sharing their own struggles with mental health, addiction, or feelings of worthlessness. Reading their words, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He decided then and there that he wanted to dedicate his life to helping others find strength in their brokenness, just as he had begun to do. With Captain Eleanor Hart's encouragement, Marcus started volunteering regularly at community centers and youth programs. He mentored young athletes, teaching them not only how to box, but also how to handle setbacks and channel their emotions constructively. Boxing isn't about anger, he would tell them during training sessions. It's about discipline, about knowing when to push forward and when to step back. His advice resonated deeply, especially with kids who saw themselves in him, kids who dreamed of greatness, but feared falling short. Meanwhile, Marcus continued working on himself. Therapy remained a cornerstone of his routine, helping him unpack years of buried pain and self-doubt. He learned healthier ways to cope with stress, whether through meditation, journaling, or simply talking to trusted friends. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt his relationships with family members he had pushed away during his darkest days. Though reconciliation wasn't always easy, Marcus approached it with humility and patience, determined to make amends where he could. Captain Hart stayed involved in Marcus's life, checking in periodically to see how he was doing. Their bond had grown stronger over time, evolving into a friendship built on mutual respect and trust. One evening, as they sat together after a particularly inspiring session with a group of teenagers, Eleanor turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way, Marcus," she said. "But I think you're realizing something important. That redemption isn't a destination. It's a process." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and using those lessons to build a better future. He no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstance or a prisoner of his mistakes. Instead, he viewed himself as someone capable of growth, someone who could inspire others to believe in their own potential. As months turned into years, Marcus's efforts began to bear fruit. The community center where he volunteered expanded its programs, offering more resources for mental health support and mentorship. Local schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where he shared his story openly, encouraging students to embrace challenges rather than fear them. Even the Royal Guard recognized his contributions, inviting him to participate in future events aimed at promoting awareness and compassion. One crisp autumn morning, as Marcus stood outside the same arena where the charity match had taken place, he paused to take it all in. The banners hanging nearby bore messages of hope and perseverance, and young voices filled the air with laughter and energy. Looking around, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the second chance he'd been given, for the people who had believed in him, and for the opportunity to pay it forward. He knew life wouldn't always be perfect. There would still be tough days, moments of doubt, and obstacles to overcome. But Marcus also knew this. He was no longer afraid of falling down, because every time he did, he had the tools and the courage to get back up again. And that, he realized, was the true measure of strength.